Welcome back, everyone, to another exploration into the Edge of Reality series right here on Beyond the Known.
Great to be back.
So, in our last deep dive, we were looking way out there into the cosmos, really grappling with the unseen universe, dark matter, and dark energy.
Yeah, that was a big one. We talked about, how galaxies spin faster than they should based on visible matter alone. Vera Rubin's work really highlighted that.
Exactly. That was some key research material we looked at. And then there was the bullet cluster.
Oh, yeah, the bullet cluster evidence, where you can almost see the dark matter separating from the normal stuff during that collision. Pretty compelling visual.
It really is. And we touched on how dark matter shapes things on the grandest scales. The cosmic microwave background, the whole structure of the universe.
And then, of course, we shifted to that other huge mystery, dark energy. That force pushing everything apart, accelerating the expansion. Sort of the opposite pull to dark matter's gravity, in a way.
Right. So, okay, from the vastness of space, today we're shifting focus dramatically. We're turning inward to maybe the most intimate mystery there is, consciousness.
Quite a shift. But, like dark matter and energy, it's something absolutely fundamental to our existence, yet really hard to pin down scientifically.
Absolutely. It feels so immediate, so real, but explaining it, that's the challenge. And just like before, we've gathered a serious stack of research materials, centuries of philosophy, cutting-edge neuroscience, all sorts of perspectives.
Yeah, we're going to try and unpack it. We'll look at how people thought about it historically, the link between thought and awareness early on. Then dive into the modern science, different definitions, the famous hard problem.
And the theories. There are so many different attempts to explain it. So, okay, let's start maybe with that historical view. Our research shows people have been wrestling with this for ages. John Locke, for instance.
Right, Locke. Back in the, late 17th century, he saw consciousness as absolutely vital for thought, for our sense of self, our identity over time. But what's interesting, like you said, is he wasn't really trying to figure out the physical basis. He just saw it as fundamental to being a thinking person, how it worked, how it connected to identity. That was his focus.
Okay. And then Leibniz came along a bit later, and he added more layers, didn't he? Even suggesting things happening below awareness.
Exactly. Leibniz had this really fascinating idea of Petit's perceptions, these tiny unconscious mental blips constantly happening beneath the surface.
Wow. Okay.
And he made that key distinction between just perceiving something and being aware that you're perceiving, which is much closer to our idea of self-awareness. And his mill analogy is still so powerful, the idea that if you blew up a brain to the size of a mill and walked inside, you'd see parts moving, interacting, but you wouldn't see a thought or a feeling.
Right. Just mechanisms. It really drives home that apparent gap between the physical stuff and the subjective experience.
It absolutely does. How does the machinery produce the feeling?
And for a long time, as our material shows, studying the mind meant studying conscious thought. People like Hume, James Mill, focused on how ideas connect in awareness.
Yeah, associationism was all about mapping those connections between conscious ideas. But then, John Stuart Mill, James's son, he started hinting at something different, this idea of mental emergence.
Emergence, meaning?
Well, the idea that when you combine mental elements, you can get something totally new, something more than just the sum of the parts. Like hydrogen and oxygen make water, which has properties neither gas has alone. Maybe mind works like that.
Interesting. Okay. Then scientific psychology gets going mid-19th century. Wundt, William James. They started using introspection, right? Looking inward.
Right. Introspection became the big tool, trying to systematically analyze one's own conscious experience. It was the main method for a while.
But that fundamental question remained. How does this inner experience actually relate to the physical brain?
Exactly. The mystery didn't go away. T.H. Huxley's analogy, consciousness popping out of the brain like a djinn from a lamp, it just perfectly captures that feeling of, magic, almost. How does that happen?
Yeah, it highlights the sheer unaccountability of it.
Yeah.
But then things shifted again. Consciousness kind of faded from view in psychology for a bit.
Yeah, early 20th century, especially in the U.S., behaviorism took over. Focus on what you can see. Stimulus response. Forget the black box of the mind. Forget consciousness. It wasn't seen as scientifically tractable.
But not everywhere, right? Our research mentioned Europe.
Good point. In Europe, Gestalt psychology kept the flame alive, so to speak. They were still very interested in conscious experience, particularly perception, how we organize the world visually, for example.
Okay, so it didn't vanish completely. And then much later, there was this big comeback.
Oh, definitely. The 80s and 90s saw a huge resurgence. You had philosophers and scientists, Bars, Dennett, Penrose, Crick, David Chalmers is a big name, really bringing consciousness back to the forefront.
Suddenly it was okay to study it again.
More than okay. You started seeing dedicated journals, societies, big conferences, all focused squarely on understanding consciousness. It became a legitimate, even exciting field of inquiry again.
Which brings us to the tricky part, defining it. Our research shows it's not straightforward. Nagel's what it is like idea is often the starting point.
Yeah, Thomas Nagel's paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? It's classic. His core point is about subjectivity. An organism is conscious if there's something that it is like to be that organism.
From the inside.
From the inside, that first-person perspective. And the bat example is brilliant because echolocation is so alien to us. We can understand the physics, the neurobiology, but can we truly grasp the subjective experience of navigating the world that way? Nagel argues probably not.
It really emphasizes how private and maybe inaccessible conscious experience is from the outside.
Right.
Okay, then there's the idea of qualia.
Right, qualia. These are supposed to be the raw feels of experience, the specific redness of red, the taste of pineapple, the feeling of pain, the actual qualitative character of our sensations.
The building blocks of experience, almost.
Sort of, but as our research points out, it's hugely debated. Are qualia real? Are they private, non-physical properties? Or are they just features of how our brain represents information? Philosophers strongly disagree. Some, like Dennett, are very skeptical about the whole concept as traditionally understood.
Okay. So even the basic feels are controversial. What about phenomenal states? That sounds broader.
It is broader. Phenomenal consciousness isn't just about individual qualia, but the overall structure and character of your experience at any given moment. It includes the sensory stuff, sure, but also how it's all organized spatially, temporally, your sense of self being in a world, the whole integrated picture.
So less about the individual color swatch, more about the entire painting.
That's a good way to put it. It's the whole subjective field, the unified stream of experience.
And it's interesting how we talk about consciousness as if it's a single thing. The research touches on this. Reification.
Yeah, we turn the adjective conscious into the noun consciousness. And that noun can mean different things. Are we talking about whether an organism is conscious at all, creature consciousness, or whether a specific mental state is conscious state consciousness?
Right.
And then there are different types people talk about. Phenomenal consciousness, the what it's likeness. Access consciousness, information available for report and control. Reflexive consciousness, awareness of self. Narrative consciousness, the story we tell ourselves. It gets complicated. Is consciousness one thing or just a label for these different aspects?
Which leads us right into what David Chalmers called the hard problem. This seems central.
Absolutely central. Chalmers really crystallized it. The easy problems, he said, are things like explaining how the brain processes information, how it controls behavior, focuses attention, distinguishes stimuli. Things cognitive science works on. They're not easy, but we have a framework for tackling them. The hard problem is, why does all that physical processing feel like anything at all from the inside? Why isn't it all just complex computation happening in the dark, functionally equivalent, but without any subjective glow, any inner life? That's the mystery.
Why the feeling? Why the qualia? Why the subjective experience accompanying the function?
Precisely. Why and how does physics give rise to phenomenology?
And those thought experiments like philosophical zombies.
Yeah.
They're used to illustrate this, right?
Exactly. The idea of a P-zombie, a being physically, behaviorally identical to you or me, molecule for molecule, but with zero conscious experience inside. Lights are off. If such a being is conceivable, it suggests consciousness is something extra, not automatically entailed by the physical setup.
Or the inverted spectrum, someone sees red where we see green, but calls it green and behaves normally. Their physical state might be identical when looking at grass, but the inner experience is different.
Right. These arguments push the idea that you can't just read consciousness off the physical facts. There seems to be this gap.
The explanatory gap.
Yep, that's Joseph Levine's term. This seeming inability to bridge the gap between objective third-person descriptions of brain activity and the subjective first-person reality of conscious experience. How do you get from neurons firing to the feeling of warmth? It feels like we're missing a crucial piece of the explanation.
Okay, so facing this hard problem, this gap, no wonder there are so many different theories trying to bridge it or explain it away. Let's try to map out some of the main ones, starting with materialism.
Okay. So materialism says everything is physical, ultimately, but materialists differ on how consciousness fits in. Type A materialism is strongly reductionist. Think Dennett, the Churchlands. They basically argue the hard problem is kind of a misunderstanding, maybe an illusion created by the brain.
An illusion. Consciousness feels pretty real.
Well, illusionism, like Keith Frankish proposes, doesn't necessarily mean it feels like nothing, but that our belief that consciousness has these special, irreducible, non-physical properties is mistaken. The real problem, for them, is explaining why it seems that way, the illusion problem. Gazzaniga's interpreter module idea also fits here, the brain creating a narrative that explains our actions, giving us a sense of unified self and awareness.
So type A says it's all physical, maybe just complex computation, and the magic feeling is a kind of cognitive trick.
Roughly, yes. Then you have type B materialism. They agree consciousness is physical, but they think the identity isn't obvious just from analyzing the concepts. It's something we discover empirically, like discovering water is H2O.
So the hard problem feels hard because our concepts of physical brain state and subjective feeling are different, even if they refer to the same underlying reality.
Exactly. It's an identity we discover a posteriori, through experience, not a priori, through reason alone. The difficulty is conceptual, not ontological. There isn't actually a non-physical consciousness, just different ways of knowing the same physical thing.
Okay. And type C?
Type C is basically saying, we don't know yet, we need more science. It leaves the door open. Maybe future physics or neuroscience will reveal how consciousness fits in, and it could end up looking like type A, type B, or maybe even something more radical. It's an admission of current limitations.
Got it. Now, moving away from pure materialism, we have dualism, the classic mind-body split.
Right. Dualism says consciousness is fundamentally not physical. It's a different kind of substance, like Descartes thought, or a fundamental property of the universe distinct from physical properties.
Oh.
Our research mentioned one intriguing, though highly speculative, link, quantum mechanics.
Ah, the idea that consciousness collapses the wave function.
Yeah, the idea that observation, maybe conscious observation, is needed to turn quantum possibilities into definite realities. It's controversial, but it suggests a way consciousness could interact with the physical world without being reducible to it. Most neuroscientists aren't dualists, but it remains a philosophical option.
Then there's the complete opposite, idealism or cosmopsychism.
Right. Instead of consciousness arising from matter, maybe matter arises from consciousness. Idealism says consciousness is primary. Cosmopsychism is related in the idea that the universe itself is conscious, and our individual minds are somehow parts of that larger consciousness.
That certainly solves the hard problem. If consciousness is fundamental, you don't need to explain how it emerges from non-conscious stuff.
True, but it faces the decombination problem, as our research called it. If the universe is one big conscious mind, how do you get all these separate individual conscious selves like us? How does the cosmic mind split itself up? Bernardo Kastrup suggests maybe cosmic dissociation, like a cosmic version of multiple personalities.
Fascinating. Okay, what about the new Mysterians? That sounds intriguing.
Yeah, Colin McGinn is the main proponent. It's basically the view that the hard problem might be genuinely unsolvable by humans. Our cognitive architecture just might not be equipped to understand how brains produce subjective experience, just like, say, a dog can't understand calculus.
So it's not that there isn't an answer, but that we're perhaps biologically incapable of grasping it.
That's the idea. A bit pessimistic, maybe, but it acknowledges the sheer difficulty.
Okay, let's shift to theories proposing more specific mechanisms. Integrated information theory, IIT, gets a lot of attention.
It does. Developed by Tononi, championed by Koch, it's very ambitious. It defines consciousness mathematically as the amount of integrated information a system possesses, symbolized by IFI.
Integrated information.
Essentially, how much a system's current state contains information about its past and future states, and how integrated that information is, meaning the system can't be broken down into independent parts without losing information. The theory claims consciousness is identical to way. The higher the I, the more conscious the system.
Which has big implications.
Huge. It implies panpsychism, that consciousness isn't limited to brains, but could exist in degrees in anything with a non-zero, maybe even simple circuits or particles, though perhaps vanishingly small amounts. It's mathematically rigorous, but philosophically radical.
Okay. Then there's global workspace theory. More cognitive.
Yes, Bars and Dehane are key figures. It's more focused on the function of consciousness within the brain's cognitive architecture. It compares consciousness to a global workspace, like a central blackboard or stage.
The stage.
Yeah, where information from specialized unconscious processors can be broadcast and made available to many other systems for memory, planning, reporting, action control. What becomes conscious is what makes it onto this global stage. It mainly explains access consciousness, what we're aware of and can use.
Right, the information we can access and report. We also saw higher order theories and representational theories mentioned.
Briefly, higher order theories say a mental state is conscious if you have another mental state about it, a higher order thought or perception. So seeing red is conscious if you're also aware that you're seeing red. Representational theories focus on the content. Consciousness is a certain kind of representational content in the brain.
And Dennett's multiple drafts model. That sounds different again.
Very different. Dennett rejects the idea of a single, unified stream or Cartesian theater where consciousness happens. Instead, he suggests there are multiple parallel processing streams, multiple drafts of interpretation and response. What becomes conscious is simply whichever draft wins out and influences behavior and further thought. There's no specific moment it enters a special conscious spotlight.
No central stage, just competing processes.
Exactly. It's a very deflationary view, challenging our intuitions about a unified self and a continuous stream of awareness.
Okay, quickly, there were also cognitive theories, neural theories, and quantum theories.
Right. Cognitive theories link consciousness to specific information processing architectures. Neural theories, like early Crick and Koch work, look for specific neural correlates of consciousness, like specific brain regions firing or particular patterns of neural oscillations, say gamma waves, that reliably correlate with conscious experience.
And quantum theories.
These suggest consciousness is fundamentally linked to quantum physics. Penrose and Hamrock's Orch-Orr model proposes quantum computations happening in microtubules within neurons. Others, including Chalmers speculatively, explore if information itself, maybe at the quantum level, could be the bridge between the physical and the phenomenal, hinting at a form of panpsychism again.
Wow, okay, that's a whirlwind tour of theories. So given all this, what does consciousness actually do? Why did it evolve? That seems like the next big question.
It really is, and it immediately bumps up against the worry of epiphenomenalism.
Meaning consciousness is just a side effect. Like the steam from a train whistle, it accompanies the action but doesn't drive the engine.
Precisely. Especially concerning qualia. Maybe the feeling of red doesn't actually cause you to stop at a light. Maybe unconscious processes do that, and the feeling just happens alongside. That's a disturbing thought for many.
But surely it must do something useful, evolutionarily speaking.
Most researchers think so. One strong possibility, as Lorenz and Gallistel suggested, is that consciousness provides a unified, integrated model of reality. It brings together sensory information, memory, goals, allowing for much more flexible, context-sensitive, and less rigidly programmed responses than purely unconscious reflexes would allow.
So it helps us adapt to complex, unpredictable situations?
Plausibly, yes. And then there's the link to free will. Our research mentioned Hasker and Dennett. It's hard to conceive of genuine choice or self-determination without awareness of oneself, one's options, one's reasons. That metamental awareness seems crucial.
And emotions. The feeling part.
That seems vital. Think about pleasure and pain. Nicholas Humphrey argued that the raw feel of these states is intrinsically motivating. Pain feels bad, and that feeling directly motivates avoidance. Pleasure feels good, motivating approach. The subjective quality itself might be what gives these states their powerful causal role in guiding behavior.
Okay, that makes intuitive sense.
And
the global availability idea from workspace theory.
Right, that's another potential function, making crucial information widely available across the brain for coordinated action, learning, planning. Though, as Chalmers points out, we need to distinguish, is consciousness constituted by this function, or is it just contingently realized alongside it? Could you have the global availability without the feeling? Back to the hard problem in a way.
Which circles back to the fundamental challenge. Subjectivity. How do we even study this scientifically?
It's the core methodological problem. Consciousness is first person. Science strives for third-person objectivity. How do you get objective data about subjective experience? We rely on things like verbal reports, yes, I see the red light, or introspection, but we know those can be unreliable, influenced by expectation, memory, interpretation.
So the data is indirect at best.
Largely, yes. That's why philosophical analysis, conceptual clarification, and thought experiments are so important in this field. They help us define the questions clearly, test the coherence of theories, and figure out what kinds of empirical evidence would even be relevant. We need both science and philosophy working together.
Our final bit of research touched on something slightly different: transformative experiences.
Yeah, this adds another dimension. Christof Koch's account of his near-death experience, how it profoundly changed his perspective, reducing his fear of death. Or reports from people using psychedelics or in deep meditation or having intense religious or mystical experiences.
These single events can really shift someone's whole view of reality and self.
Apparently so. Annika Harris talks about this too, the fundamental felt nature of experience in the universe. And it even pushes some people to look at, say, plants like that daughter vine sensing light and making complex decisions about which host to attach to, and wonder if maybe some very basic form of sentience is more widespread than we think.
It certainly broadens the perspective beyond just human consciousness.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, this has been quite the journey into consciousness. It's undeniably one of the ultimate frontiers, isn't it?
Absolutely. It sits right at the intersection of science, philosophy, and our own personal experience. As we've seen from the research material, the perspectives are incredibly diverse, from ancient philosophy to quantum physics, really.
Yeah, we've covered a lot: qualia, the hard problem, IIT, global workspace, the sheer difficulty of bridging subjective and objective. It really highlights how complex this is.
And the implications are just massive, aren't they? Medical ethics around brain injury or coma, the possibility of AI consciousness, how we treat animals, maybe even our whole place in the cosmos. It touches everything.
It definitely gives us, and hopefully our listeners, a lot to think about regarding our own inner world, our own conscious experience, and all these big questions.
Hopefully this deep dive has provided some useful frameworks and highlighted the key debates in this fascinating area.
Well, thank you for joining us on this exploration into the profound mystery of consciousness. If you found this deep dive stimulating, please do like, follow, and subscribe to Beyond the Known. We'll be back with more journeys to the edges of reality.